Institution.
Psycho.
Jail.
Insanity.
Evil.
Numerous elements have changed within psychiatric care and the way in which society views patients that use the service. Today's society is a lot more understanding and compassionate towards people who are suffering with a mental illness and don't dominate or abuse them in the ways that we have been known to in the past. In this documentary, we are going to be exploring what caused attitudes and treatments to change so dramatically. To conduct this investigation, we're going to focus on the former West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum that opened in 1818 and closed down as Stanley Royd in 1995.
The Wakefield Asylum is a really interesting institution to look at it. It was opened in 1818 as the West Riding Pauper Lunatic Asylum, and the emphasis is on the pauper there. It came out of the 1808 County Asylums Act, and it meant that poor people, so the lowest economic strata of the ladder, needed to be supported. What happened was, when it opened in 1818, it was designed for 150 patients, and there were 150 acres. So that's 1 acre per individual that's there. What happened was, in around the 1840s and 1860s, there was a big boom. There was a real need for more space. So it did expand. It expanded itself, and it took in more patients at the time.
In the bathroom, there was 2 baths. So there were no, at that time, there wasn't an awful lot of emphasis put on privacy and dignity. And we did hear stories of people, routinely being put on commodes in rows because the staffing levels and there were so many patients and so much work to do. So privacy and dignity wasn't as much high profile as it is today in mental health nursing.
Now that building opened in 1818 but changed and developed, particularly over the First World War. Again, we were having lots of people coming home with what we now know as sort of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, but was then known as shell shock. So we had this problem where these institutions were growing rapidly. General hospitals were as well, but our asylum institutions were, and they needed to take in more and more people. What happens is when you have 1947 and you've got the NHS gets introduced as the National Health Service, so that's fantastic on the one hand, but it also means there's more responsibility to take on and look after more people. So in these asylums, you're having this kind of persisting idea around bloodletting and vomiting, and also using enemas as a form of evacuating the bowels to make someone feel better. But you've also got these experimentations that are happening and research that's going on. So what we now know as electroconvulsive therapy, ECT, started from early shock treatments that were in the late sort of Victorian period. But what we have at Wakefield Asylum, in advancement in treatment, was a very specific period of time between 1876 and 1886, when Crichton Browne was the medical director. He really wanted to focus on brain research, and it was a completely revolutionary, and for a period of time Wakefield was the epicenter, the birth of what we now know as neuroscience, because he made sure that every patient that passed away would be go through to the pathology lab, and they would cut the body up and they would look at the brain. Now, it's a very difficult history because from a human rights perspective, people were in these asylums being looked after, but their rights after they passed away really meant they were owned by the asylum, and therefore these experimentations happened often without the family's say-so or approval. But if that hadn't have happened, we won't be where we are now in terms of understanding the brain, understanding how there can be physical problems in the brain that cause mental health problems.
People who were in hospital who were really ill with mental conditions, really they were a captive audience. They were very vulnerable people. So research was done. Underlying all this, though, there was this idea that people should be treated kindly and humanely. But as with any group of people that are vulnerable, a lot more so in the past maybe than than currently. But even so, today you see in the news many places where vulnerable people are in groups together and in a way captive to the circumstances. Abuse can and does sometimes happen, so it's something you've always got to be aware of, to watch out for and protect these people.